My name is Laura, and I never imagined that at 42, my life would take such an unexpected turn. I had always been seen as the pillar of the family, the responsible older sister, the one who kept everyone together. I married Richard nearly 2 decades ago, and to everyone around us, we had the perfect marriage. But the truth is, I had felt emotionally distant from him for years. Richard is a good man, dedicated to his work, but often absent in every other way. Over time, I began to feel more and more lonely and neglected. I tried to ignore these feelings, focusing on keeping the family together and taking care of everyone around me. But deep down, something was missing. It was during the weekend of our wedding anniversary that everything changed. The whole family gathered at our country house to celebrate. My sister, Sophie, her husband, and my nephew, Ethan, came, along with other close relatives. I was excited at the prospect of having everyone together, but there was also an inexplicable anxiety that I couldn't shake. Ethan, Sophie's son, was 24 now. I had watched him grow up, and we always had a special bond, something everyone saw as a loving aunt-nephew relationship. But in recent months, something had shifted. His glances lingered a little longer, his questions seemed deeper. And I, to my shame, found myself thinking about him in ways I never should. On Friday night, after dinner, everyone was gathered in the living room, talking and laughing. Richard, as usual, was absorbed in a conversation about work with my brother-in-law. I watched the scene, feeling strangely out of place, when I noticed Ethan looking at me from across the room. Our eyes met, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I quickly looked away, disturbed by the intensity of the moment. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't relax. I stepped outside into the garden, hoping the cool night air would clear my muddled thoughts. The full moon lit up the lawn, casting long shadows between the trees. I walked to the small pond, watching the trembling reflection of the stars in the water. "Can't sleep?" Ethan's voice startled me. He was standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Just needed some air," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And you?" He stepped closer, stopping beside me, too close. "Same," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Laura, can I ask you something?" My heart started to race. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Are you happy? I mean, with Uncle Richard?" The question caught me off guard. It was too deep, too personal coming from my nephew. But something in his tone, the way he looked at me, made me answer honestly. "It's complicated," I admitted, turning my gaze back to the pond. "Marriage isn't always easy." Ethan was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, Laura. You deserve someone who sees how amazing you are." I looked at him, surprised by his words. His eyes were locked on mine, filled with an emotion I didn't want to name. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of fear and excitement I hadn't felt in years. "Ethan," I started, but the words died in my throat when he took a step closer. "I've always admired you, Laura," he said, his voice rough. "But lately, it's more than that. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you." I knew I should step away, tell him this was crazy. But my body wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself leaning toward him, as if an invisible force was pulling me in. "This can't happen," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. Ethan raised his hand, gently touching my face. The contact sent shivers through my entire body. "I know," he replied. "But I can't help how I feel." At that moment, all reason left me. I closed the distance between us, and our lips met in a desperate, passionate kiss. Years of repressed desire, loneliness, and longing exploded in that touch. His hands were on my waist, pulling me closer, while I tangled my fingers in his hair. It was as if the world had vanished around us. All I could feel were Ethan's lips on mine, his hands exploring my body, the heat radiating between us. It was wrong, I knew that. But in that moment, it felt like the only right thing in the world. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, reality began to seep back in. The weight of what we had done crashed down on me like a ton of bricks. I stepped back, horrified by my own weakness. This was a mistake, I stammered, tears beginning to form in my eyes. We can't. Ethan looked just as shaken, but there was a determination in his eyes that frightened me. Laura, I know you felt the same thing I did. This can't be a mistake. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. You're my nephew, Ethan. I'm married. It's madness. He took a step toward me, but I backed away. Please, I begged. We need to forget this ever happened. For everyone's sake. With a broken heart, I turned and ran back to the house, leaving Ethan alone in the garden. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, tossing and turning in bed next to Richard, who slept soundly, oblivious to the turmoil in my heart. The following days were a nightmare of guilt and suppressed desire. Every time I saw Ethan, my heart raced. Our eyes would meet across the room, filled with unspoken secrets and unvoiced longing. I tried to act normal, to smile and chat with everyone, but inside I was falling apart. Richard, as always, seemed completely unaware of anything being wrong. He smiled and accepted congratulations on our anniversary, totally oblivious to the fact that his marriage was crumbling right before his eyes. His ignorance only deepened my guilt. On Sunday night, our last night at the country house, everyone gathered for a farewell barbecue. The air was filled with laughter and lively conversation, but I could barely focus. My eyes kept drifting to Ethan, who sat quietly at the other end of the table, lost in thought. Sophie, my sister, seemed to notice something was off. She kept giving me worried looks, as if trying to figure out what was going on. I tried to smile and act normal, but I knew I wasn't very convincing. After dinner, while everyone was helping to clean up, Sophie pulled me aside. Laura, are you okay? You seem distant. I forced a smile. I'm fine, just a little tired. It's been an intense weekend. She gave me a skeptical look. Are you sure? You and Ethan have barely spoken all day. Did something happen? My heart froze. Could she have noticed something? No, of course not, I replied too quickly. Everything's fine. Sophie frowned, clearly unconvinced, but before she could press further, Richard interrupted, asking for help putting away the leftovers. I silently thanked him for the distraction and hurried away, feeling my sister's eyes on my back. That night, once again, I couldn't sleep. I carefully got out of bed so as not to wake Richard and went downstairs to the kitchen, thinking a cup of tea might calm my nerves. To my surprise, Ethan was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup in his hands. Our eyes met, and for a moment, we were frozen. I considered turning around and going back to my room, but something stopped me. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and began making my tea, trying to ignore the palpable tension in the air. Laura, Ethan finally broke the silence. We need to talk. I sighed, turning to face him. There's nothing to talk about, Ethan. What happened was a mistake, and it can't happen again. He stood up, walking closer to me. Do you really believe that? That it was just a mistake? My heart raced as he got closer. It has to be, I whispered. We can't do this to our family. Ethan was dangerously close now. I could feel the heat of his body, see the intensity in his eyes. What about us? Don't we deserve to be happy? Before I could answer, we heard footsteps on the stairs. We quickly stepped apart, pretending nothing was wrong as Sophie walked into the kitchen. She looked between the two of us, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on here?" "Nothing," we answered in unison, which only seemed to deepen her suspicion. Sophie crossed her arms, staring at us. "You two have been acting strange all weekend. Is there something I should know?" Panic rose in my chest. I opened my mouth to deny it, to make up some excuse, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, heavy and accusatory. It was Ethan who finally spoke. "Mom, it's nothing. Aunt Laura and I were just talking." Sophie didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed as she looked between us. "At 3 in the morning. About what?" I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. I was about to break down and confess everything when we heard more footsteps. Richard appeared in the doorway, groggy and confused. "What's going on here? Why is everyone awake?" The chaos that followed was a blur. Sophie, frustrated by our lack of answers, began to make vague accusations. Richard, still half asleep, couldn't grasp what was happening. Ethan tried to calm his mother, while I stood frozen, unable to form coherent words. In the midst of the confusion, Sophie blurted out, "There's something going on between you two, isn't there?" She pointed at Ethan and me. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard, now fully awake, looked from me to Ethan, understanding slowly dawning on his face. At that moment, I realized there was no more hiding. Tears welled up in my eyes as I began to speak. I confessed about my years of loneliness in the marriage, how Ethan and I had grown closer, about the kiss in the garden. The words poured out in a torrent, years of repressed emotions finally coming to the surface. Richard turned pale, staggering as if he had been punched. Sophie alternated between shock and fury, shouting at us. Ethan tried to explain, but his voice was drowned in the chaos. When I finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was oppressive. Richard looked at me as if he no longer recognized me. Sophie sobbed, leaning against the kitchen counter. Ethan seemed devastated, the weight of our actions finally hitting him. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, but the words felt hollow in the face of what we had done. Richard was the first to move. Without a word, he turned and left the kitchen. I heard the front door slam seconds later. Sophie followed him, casting one last look of contempt in our direction before she too was gone. I stood there, next to Ethan, both of us in shock from what had just transpired. Our family, once so close, was now shattered. And it was all our fault. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. Richard filed for divorce, unable to overcome the betrayal. Sophie refused to speak to me, cutting off all contact. The rest of the family, upon learning what had happened, was divided. Some condemned me, others tried to understand. But nothing would ever be the same. Ethan and I found ourselves alone amidst the wreckage of what we had done. The passion we once felt for each other was tainted by guilt and regret. We tried to stay together for a while, thinking that after everything we had sacrificed, we should at least try. But the shadow of our actions was too great. Months passed. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. Richard and I divorced, but over time, we managed to establish a civil relationship, mainly for the sake of our extended family. Sophie eventually started talking to me again, though our relationship was never the same. The look of disappointment in her eyes was a constant reminder of what I had done. Ethan and I drifted apart, realizing that what we had mistaken for love was actually a toxic blend of desire and rebellion against our unsatisfied lives. Months turned into years. Gradually, I rediscovered myself. For the first time in a long time, I was alone, not defined by my role as a wife, sister, or aunt. It was frightening at first, but in time, I learned to appreciate my own company. I started therapy, finally facing the demons that had led me to that situation. I realized that for years I had been suffocating my own identity, always putting the needs of others before my own. The affair with Ethan had been a desperate attempt to feel alive again, but at the cost of hurting everyone around me. 5 years had passed since that fateful weekend. I was in a cafe, working on my laptop. Over the past few years, I had started a career as a freelance writer, when I heard a familiar voice call out my name. Laura. I looked up and saw Richard standing there, a small, hesitant smile on his face. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of surprise and apprehension. Richard, I replied, closing my laptop. What a surprise to see you here. He gestured to the empty chair across from me. Can I sit? I nodded, watching as he settled in. Richard looked different, more relaxed, perhaps. The years had been kind to him. How are you? He asked, genuinely interested. I took a deep breath before answering. I'm good. Really good. And you? He smiled, a genuine smile that reminded me of the early years of our marriage. I'm doing well. Actually, I remarried 2 years ago. I felt a pang in my chest, but to my surprise, it wasn't jealousy or regret. It was a kind of genuine happiness for him. That's wonderful, Richard. I'm happy for you. Thank you, he said, seeming relieved by my reaction. Laura, I wanted to tell you something. I waited, feeling the tension in the air. I forgive you, he said simply. It took time, but I understand now. Our marriage was over long before that weekend. We both made mistakes. Tears welled up in my eyes. Richard, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for everything. He reached across the table, briefly touching my hand. I know. And it's okay now. We've both moved on. We talked for another hour, reminiscing about the good times, acknowledging the mistakes we made, and sharing our new lives. When we said our goodbyes, I felt as though a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, sitting in my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past few years. The pain I caused, the chaos I created, but also the growth I experienced. I picked up my phone and, after a moment of hesitation, called Sophie. Hi, Sophie, I said when she answered, my voice trembling slightly. I know it's been a while, but would you like to grab a coffee with me this week? There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought she might hang up. But then, I heard her voice, soft and hesitant. Yes, Laura. I'd like that. As I hung up the phone, a wave of hope washed over me. The path to redemption would be long, I knew that. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to walk it. In the months that followed, I worked hard to rebuild the bonds I had broken. Sophie and I began meeting regularly. At first, our conversations were tense and superficial, but over time, we started to confront the past. We cried together, laughed together, and slowly began to heal our relationship. Ethan and I kept our distance for a long time. It wasn't until the wedding of a mutual cousin, 2 years later, that we saw each other again. The encounter was awkward at first, laden with memories and regrets. But as the night progressed, we managed to have an honest conversation. I'm so sorry, he said, his eyes filled with remorse. I was young and immature. I didn't realize how much my actions could hurt the people I love. I nodded, understanding. I'm sorry too, Ethan. We both made mistakes. But I hope we can move forward now. He smiled, a sad but hopeful smile. I'd like that. Life went on. I published my first book, a collection of stories about love, loss, and redemption. To my surprise, it received praise from critics and readers alike. Richard and his new wife had a baby, and I felt genuine happiness for them when I received the news. Sophie and I grew close again, though in a different way. Our relationship was now based on honesty and mutual understanding, free from the secrets and resentments of the past. Ethan moved to another state, building his own life away from the shadows of the past. 10 years passed since that weekend that changed everything. I was at home, working on my new book, when I received an unexpected email. It was from Ethan. Dear Laura, I hope this email finds you well. I know it's been a long time since we last spoke, but I felt the need to share something with you. I'm engaged. Her name is Olivia, and she's wonderful. We're getting married next summer. I know this may seem strange, but I would like you to be there. You were an important part of my life, and despite everything that happened, I feel it wouldn't be right to celebrate this new chapter without acknowledging the past. I completely understand if you don't want to come. But if you do, know that you would be welcome. Warmly, Ethan. I read and reread the email several times, a mix of emotions flooding me. Surprise, nostalgia, a touch of sadness, but above all, a sense of closure. After much thought, I replied. Dear Ethan, I was touched to receive your email. Congratulations on your engagement. I am genuinely happy for you. As for the wedding invitation, I would be honored to attend. The past is behind us, and I'm glad we both found our paths. Wishing you and Olivia all the happiness in the world. Warmly, Laura. As I sent the email, a feeling of peace enveloped me. The circle was finally closing. We had all grown, learned, and moved on. That night, sitting on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset, I reflected on the journey of the last 10 years. The affair with Ethan, which once seemed like the end of everything, turned out to be a catalyst for a profound transformation in my life. I learned about forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself. I learned about honesty, about facing my own truths, no matter how painful they were. And above all, I learned that love comes in many forms, and sometimes, loving means letting go. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, I smiled to myself. Life hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every mistake, every moment of pain brought me to this point. And here, in this moment, I was at peace. The future was uncertain, as it always is. But for the first time in a long time, I faced it not with fear or regret, but with hope and acceptance. My story wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And I was ready for the next chapter, whatever it might hold.